I think within white American culture, you see it, what white Americans, Trump supporters, attribute to immigrants, attribute to Black people. It's the things that they hate the most about themselves, right? It's like Trump came out the gate calling Mexican immigrants predators, right? Lazy predators, right? He was talking about himself, right? It is easier to attribute that to another group.
Yeah.
Own self. And so I think that you see a lot of that mirror move, a lot of that projecting in American culture. It's a lot easier to say that this is a problem because of immigrants coming over. This is a problem because the way that white Americans in the South have this narrative about Black Americans being lazy. These are literally the people that they stole from Africa to work their plantation.
Far from lazy. Far from it.
I mean, wait, what? Right? Like, not hardworking. Okay, what? Right? What? So I think that you have to be careful about how very often those narratives become a projection. Like all of America's social issues could be solved with a really good community and army of social.
Welcome back to the Black and Raw podcast. I'm your host, Tino Kudatondo Ivanzabaya. I'm going to repeat that. Here's a podcast that's creating the dialogue and the space for Black men to be their most authentic selves. Now, my guest today is Darren Isom, and Darren works for Bridgespan Group, where he advises organizations and philanthropists in creating equity and social change. And Darren comes onto the podcast to talk about his work and working with billionaires and seeing, are they, giving money for the right reasons, or is it just for clout? And we talk about lots of interesting things in this episode. Darren has also been to Howard, which is a Black university in the States, and he's also studied in Paris too. So he's got quite a good cultural understanding of the US and Paris and the differences between the two. And so we discuss about that, but we also discuss about the politics of the US and about Trump and about the base and narratives that live within the US, and how the US in a lot of places are based on narratives, and how you can create narratives to create social change or to create change in some way. And so this is a really interesting episode. I really hope you guys enjoy this episode. Before you watch it, I just wanted to say please subscribe, leave a comment in the comment section what you thought about this episode. I really hope you enjoy this episode, and I don't think I have anything else more to say to you guys other than here is my conversation with Darren Isom.
Hi, Darren. So welcome to the Black and Raw podcast. It's really good to have you on.
It's great to be on. Thanks for having me.
No, it's all right. It's all right. And so I just wanted to sort of get into the meat of the episode with you. And you went to Howard University. And for those that are in the UK that are listening, or for wherever else you're listening, if you're not in the States, Howard is a Black uni, was made by Black people for Black people. And we don't have anything like that here. So what's it like attending a university which is specifically sort of made for us?
No, it's a great question, and I think it's worth noting that you guys don't have it because you don't have the same. You have your own oppression narrative, but you have the same. There's always an oppression narrative, right? I was in South Africa. It was always interesting visiting a place where the oppression narrative is different, right? So in the United States, basically, of course, most Black Americans came to the U.S. During the period of enslavement, and so we came as enslaved people. And depending on where you were in the country, you may not even been allowed to read. To learn how to read. And so in many places, the idea of a proper education was forbidden, particularly in the South of the country, but also throughout the North as well. And so that said, you weren't allowed to enter most institutions because of segregation and all the other things. So when slavery ended in the 1860s, and there's another story about Blacks being educated before that period. My family's been in New Orleans since the 1790s, right? So
Wow.
Were educated during that time as well, as they came up to New Orleans from Haiti during the Haitian Revolution. But during the 1860s, you had a huge group of Black folks who were freed officially as part of the Civil War, then the Civil War and Emancipation Proclamation. And so there was a need to create universities for those people, like the schools and universities, the whole university system. Interestingly enough, clearly folks were freed in 1865 and universities were open. Clearly people were being educated before that point. You couldn't just walk straight off the planet to university, right? And so there were schools and systems. So basically, they created this whole thing, and we call them historically Black colleges and universities. So they were schools that were started to educate free people, the free people. They were Howard was started as part of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a whole government agency set up to figure out what to do with Black people once they were free and to American society. The others across the country were started as part of religious schools or religious institutions or public sector institutions. Public schools across the South were segregated, so Blacks couldn't attend the white school, but they had to have a Black school for them. So they created a whole public education system for Blacks across the South. And so that was Howard. So there's actually 107 historical Black colleges, and we call them historical Black colleges because they were schools when Blacks were not allowed to attend white institutions. So we call historical Black colleges, then we have predominantly white institution, PWIs, that exist within the country itself. And many of us, like myself included, attended both, right?
Yeah.
I went to Howard grad, I went to grad school in Paris, and then I went to business school at CBS, Columbia Business School, which is not just a PWI, but an Ivy League school in New York. And so for me, what was interesting is that generationally, I joke that my family's been in New Orleans now for 9 generations. I'm 7th generation New Orleans native. I am the only generation that grew up in integrated schools. So before me, they were all segregated, literally. I mean, literally, Blacks could not go to schools with whites. And New Orleans was one of the few, well, not one of the few, but what that meant is that there were a segregated school system. New Orleans had such a large population of wealthy Blacks that New Orleans had a whole Black prep school thing going on. New Orleans had they're like Black prep schools, elementary school, and whatnot and so forth. And then desegregation happened. My parents actually met desegregating at school in New Orleans. They were from very different backgrounds. My dad came from a wealthier Black family that had gone to all private schools, Black private schools growing up. My mom had gone to the public Black schools. And they met desegregating this high school in their neighborhood. They would have never met. They were from only 8 blocks apart from each other. But
wow, that's kind of crazy, isn't it?
All that to say, I grew up in majority white schools. So I was in a majority Black city, but I went to all those schools that were perfectly integrated. We sang Beatles songs and hold hands and love each other. And I mean, it's like hippy dippy. They were really trying hard. At some point and realized that I'd always been one of maybe 4 or 5 Black kids in a school of white, in a class of white kids. And so I really wanted to be in an environment where I'd grown up in a Black home in a Black community, but I'd never really been educated in a Black environment.
Yeah.
So of my class of 120 kids total in my graduating high school class, there were maybe 15 of us that were Black. This is an 80% Black city. Makes no sense. And of the 15 of us, I think 10 of us went to historical Black colleges.
Okay.
Howard and Spelman. So you arrive at this campus, you've never been around as many Black people before in your life.
Yeah, it's a shock to the system.
New to me, right? And so you're there for the Black experience, but you're also there surrounded by mostly wealthy Black kids who've never been surrounded by this many Black people before in their lives either. Right.
Wow, so that's interesting.
Professors are Black, the administrators are Black. We used to joke on Howard's campus, even the squirrels were Black. We didn't have brown squirrels, we had Black squirrels on Howard's campus. And so it's a very inclusive environment. It was the first time in my life where I didn't have to think about being Black. Clearly I was Black, everyone was Black, but I could have freer conversations because I was in a room with people who were part of your community. And so you could have more nuanced conversations, right? When affirmative action comes up in a room full of white people, you know exactly what your talking points are, right? There's no deviation. You say this, you say that, right? But you can have more nuanced conversations when you're surrounded by allies and you're surrounded by your community. And it was just a great time to be at Howard. Ta-Nehisi Coates, the writer, was a few years ahead of me. And then we also had Chadwick Boseman, was a few years after me. So
wow, that's cool.
And historical Black college is just magical places. You pull the best of Black America in many ways. Many of us did, Howard for undergrad, and then we joke there's the Howard-Harvard situation. We used to go to Howard for undergrad, go to Black college for undergrad, and you go to an Ivy League school for grad school, and balance off the experience. But it was 4 years of peace. I joke that if nothing else, it was 4 years of not being bothered with white people, which was a really wonderful experience. Well, 3 years. I did my junior year abroad in Paris, which is a different experience, but yeah, so that was Howard for me. It was a wonderful experience, and I encourage everyone, if they can, to attend a historical Black college. It's very freeing, very liberating, it's great to be in a place where your intelligence, your prominence, all of your things is understood. It's understood. You don't have to prove it.
Yeah, definitely. No, that sounds quite good actually, quite interesting. Especially as you were saying, you grew up in you grew up in a black neighborhood, but your school somehow didn't represent that. And that then you were able to go to Howard and that you had everybody, that was just like you. And you were saying the conversations you had were more nuanced. And even the fact that I sort of had a similar my upbringing, I was surrounded by quite a lot of white people. And then my university that I went to was in Stoke, which is even more whiter. So I was still surrounded by white people. But what it was interesting and what I think I would have, if I always say that I would always love to try and experience different lives, like if I had multiple lives, because I went to a school where I think there was only one black lecturer, and I literally and he was great. I loved him. I think I loved him more because he was black, because some people are like, oh, he doesn't get through all the content. He sort of just rambles. I'm like, no, guys, he's good. He's good. He's just passionate. And I think that definitely probably came out of a sort of a protection point of like, oh, wait, no, I need to protect this guy because he's the only one that I see that's like that. That's like me. So
No, 100%. I think that there's something powerful. I mean, within the Black school experiment environment, I think what's, something I'm really thankful for growing up. Yeah, I grew up in a Black home. I grew up in a Black neighborhood. It was mostly a Black city at the time, but I've always been in very white circles, just in general, educationally, professionally, and otherwise. But I do think my parents did an amazing job of normalizing Blackness and different forms of Blackness, right? And so I grew up in a space where that there were just Black people doing all the things, right? Like anything. I joke even at Howard, there was one point I was visiting a friend who was on a college campus at a dorm. And I was walking into the hallway. Can you hold on just 1 second?
yeah.
Well, I was walking into the hallway, walking to the dorm area, and then from one dorm room, there was the Fugees blasting, right? And from the other dorm room, there was the Cranberries, right? And it was hilarious because in that Cranberries super, not necessarily the blackest of music.
Okay.
Wasn't myself generationally there, right? And Fugees, of course, Lauryn Hill became part of the Fugees and whatnot and so forth.
Okay,
but it was part of the Fugees before she broke out. But in that moment, it was I was like, Lauryn Hill in the Fugees, I thought of as being Black music, but the Cranberries, not so much. But it's in that point, I learned that if you're doing it as a Black person, it's a Black thing, right? And so just the fact that you're doing it makes it a Black thing. And so what was interesting is that I realized how forgiving, to some degree, and inclusive the definition of Blackness is. At Howard, you had Black professors. There were Black professors who were walking out German studies. I have friends with German studies majors. If Black people study German, we have a whole studies department, I guess so, right? And so I think that it normalized Blackness in a way that gave me so many different options. I didn't feel like I had to fit into a very narrow definition of Blackness. And that was wonderful because ultimately, at the end of the day, my grandmother used to always say that what God's greatest gift to man was that of free will. And our gift back to God was living our lives as beautifully as possible, exercising that free will. And so with that meant that we should have options on how we live our lives. And we should feel as if however we're living our life is an authentic way to be who we are, right? And so I think that was great about Howard. He gave me the space to recognize that Blackness came in so many different forms, so many different areas, so many different regions. And the culture was a very forgiving and inclusive one, not one that was narrow.
Yeah, no, I mean that just sounds really cool, to be honest with you. And that's something which I try and do, which you're trying to do with Black and Raw, is that you can be Black and you can still love all the things that you love. And it's great that there's institutions which sort of are just demonstrating that, but not demonstrating it through oh no, we're gonna force it down you, but just come and just be you, just do what you come and do.
It's just normalized all of it, totally normalized all of it.
Yeah, definitely. And so you said you went to go and study in Paris, which I imagine was definitely a completely different experience. What was that like?
No, it was a different experience. And so I'd grown up in New Orleans. So New Orleans, I joke all the time when I studied in France, and I actually ended up going back to France for grad school. I did a Fulbright in Paris and studied at Sciences Po there. And I'd be in these classes of students, and the French would love talking about, oh, America, products of Anglo-Saxon culture and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I'm from New Orleans. Like, my region was colonized by the French and the Spanish. I don't necessarily know it's this Anglo-Saxon culture that you're talking about. But okay, whatever, right? And so, my family's from New Orleans. It came to New Orleans from another French colony. At the time, it was Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue became Haiti after the Revolution. Our family came to New Orleans during the Haitian Revolution. So we don't talk about the fact that there were two waves of migrants from Earth, were white landowners who were kicked off the island. And that's a nice way of saying they were escaping being killed. And then and they came to New Orleans because New Orleans was a French colony at the time, so it's friendly territory. And then 5 years later, the Black free people of color in Haiti who helped kick out the white people were kicked out if they were landowning, right? And so we landed in New Orleans as well. So it's a not too friendly arrival, right?
Yeah, I can't imagine.
So I always had a French connection. Historically within the city itself, New Orleans spoke French until my great-grandparents' generation. So there's definitely a French, speaking culture. You grew up with the normalization of French culture is once again being accessible. Like there's the big joke in Black American culture. Anyone with, not always, but Michelle, Denise, Nicole, Ivani, that they're probably a Black girl, right? It's like names are very normalized in French culture, and that's because of New Orleans. New Orleans was this French city that had a very prominent Black middle class that had French things. So France was always accessible for Black Americans. Like it's a place that we can go. It's understood to be a place that we can return to some degree. And so I'd always wanted to study in France. I went for my junior year abroad. It was a wonderful experience. I joke all the time, once again, that in France was the first time I felt like an American, how silly that may sound.
Interesting.
In the States, I was Black, and there was a definite culture associated with Black American culture. It was a cultural identity I was very proud of. It was a beautiful culture. In France, I was American. And the fact that I was Black was an accessory, right? Like I was American first. My passport was American then. And so I experienced the privilege of being an American, and for the first time in my life.
Wow,
right?
imagine, not in America, but in France.
No, not in America, but in France, right? Like you get to France and people assume that you're wealthy. People assume that you're educated. There's a certain degree of space you're allowed to have, allowed to take up, place you're allowed to be in. And so it was a very freeing experience. At the same time, I also recognized that I was getting a very unique experience as a Black American. Like I saw other Black people in France who were not being treated the same way I was. And I saw that the French did not consider me as with them, right? Like I was a different subset. Like people would say things about Black people or Africans, and I'd be like, yo, dude, I'm
right here.
I'm right here. They'd be like, oh, Darren, don't be silly. You're not an immigrant. You're an expat.
You know what? I've always, that language is always crazy because expats are just immigrants. Like but it's just how you phrase it. It's how people phrase it. But
one, the connotation is that one group is taking something from the country as opposed to the other group is giving something to the country, right? Expats are seen as wealthy and not necessarily draining the system. But I was definitely there taking all the things I could from France. And so it was a great experience. I think you also realize how American you are to some degree as well. Like you have a lot in common with your white American folks, right? In a way that you've never really appreciated, right? Like you're in a neighborhood, and as Americans being Americans, like you're visiting this beautiful neighborhood, and your first thought is, I wonder how much it costs to live here. You ask, like, so, or your counterpart, your white American counterpart was like, so how much does an apartment cost in this area? And the French person's like, oh my God, these things we do not ask, right? These are things that are very American, right? You think about the world. And so you realize in some ways your connection to the larger Black diaspora, but you also recognize that you're in many ways, like not only are you a part of American culture, but you've shaped American culture. American culture is very Black, right? And so it was a wonderful experience. I also came out in Paris, right? So I was kind of a closeted gay guy through my first few years of college. And that means I didn't focus on my social life. I focused on school, right? Yeah. Days all through college, right? I was in the books, and I came out in Paris and came back to DC senior year. I was like, I have to get back to Paris. Like it was so fun and so freeing. And I remember asking my advisor, how do I do that? She's like, you can always apply for a Fulbright, this random scholarship that I knew nothing about. Fellowship. Ended up going back to Paris and studying French immigration policy and xenophobia towards ethnic minorities in French suburbs. Right. So how like France did not have a sense of multiculturalism as something that exists in French culture. There's a French culture whatever multicultural you're doing, I don't know what it is, but it ain't French, right? And so it's just a very interesting way of studying abroad and living abroad. And I have really good friends in France. I have really good relationships from there. I've gone back to France before. I've spent a semester there teaching at my grad school. I'm on the board of my grad school. I'm going back in the fall for sabbatical.
Yeah.
So it was a wonderful experience as well, and something that everyone should try to do if they can.
Yeah, I haven't been to France yet. But it's a place I
In the world?
what did you say? Say that again.
It's right there. What do you mean? You
Yeah,
haven't been
I know. My I really want to go, to be honest. It looks lush. I want to go to the south of France as well. That also looks lush.
Yeah.
But
We'll be in France in the fall. We'll spend the first 2 weeks in the south, so in Saint-Tropez on T before heading up to Paris and spend some time.
I'm
So
jealous.
it's
Maybe
all very
I can hop
yeah.
over. I'll send you an email. I'll be like, yo, whenever you're there, I'll come along. But yeah, I that sounds really interesting. And I even think, as you were saying, the French, just, it's interesting, expats and immigrants, and how that is all viewed. And even you doing your thesis and studying about French migration and multiculturalism, I think it is really interesting in terms of how, France is probably, I mean, Britain had the biggest empire, but France had a pretty sizable one. And the fact that they benefited so much from immigrants, and they probably need them in their country now, but that the multiculturalism, one thing which is good about Britain is that they sort of have embraced multiculturalism, even though there are flaws to it. They definitely have embraced it. And I think that's probably made the country quite better in general. But it is interesting how the French have taken a much different approach.
Yeah, it's when we're talking about, and they're all colonizers, right? And so I try not to romanticize different countries and different colonizers. They're all problematic in the worst way possible. So and I've always found it interesting that, well, that's another conversation for another day. Like when you talk about how colonizers and their different approaches to colonization, and some are more brutal than others. They're all horribly brutal and have done absolutely horrible things. And if you sit back and think about colonialism, how it's worked out, the way we've wrapped our head around such a perverse system is another conversation for another day. There's a lot of Stockholm syndrome happening there. But I do think there is very much so a difference in how the colonial approaches, right? I think we say all the time within the international affairs world that British colonialism was, you can act however you like as long as you think the same. So your outward appearance was of absolutely no importance. So when they went to places like the good Jesuit Catholics, how you behave, you can keep your religion, you can keep your culture, you can keep your dress, but there's a British way of thinking about things that you must maintain, right? And the French, where you can think however you like, as long as you act the same, right? And so the vie privée, how you think in your house and what you do in your house is your business. But when you show up on the street, there's a way to look, there's a way to act, there's a way to appear. Right. And I think those are very different colonial approaches, which is played out within the culture itself, the cultures themselves. I think what's interesting about French culture is that France is very much so outwardly anti-multiculturalism, but I can't think of any other culture that's more fusion than French culture.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, look at their football team.
France benefited more from all of its colonies, culturally. There was even a wonderful article, once again, I'm from New Orleans, this wonderful article on all of the various African cooks, African Caribbean chefs who've come in New Orleans and set up shop. And they were talking about how there's this belief that New Orleans is a French city from a cultural perspective, when in actuality, it's an African city where just all the dishes are in French. Right? All these dishes are African dishes, étouffée, this, jambalaya, that, but they're all African dishes with French names. And I think that's the same in French culture. All these things that are French things, they're actually products of their colonies, right? Everything from sugar culture and patisserie culture, those all comes from they're colonizing the sugar creating world, right? And chocolate and all those things came from outside of the country itself. So I think that their French culture has been so shaped by their colonies that their multiculturalism is reflected in their culture itself. Whereas England, I'm not quite, I don't understand the Brits at all. I don't even try to pretend to. I can only wrap my head around one colonizer at a time. But I think that the Brits are painfully proud of the fact that they don't have a national cuisine, right? It's but we have a good curry.
Yeah,
right? Like in
which is not
France,
even
Peru,
ours.
right? Like, so it's just very different approaches to to thinking about the world, all perverse and problematic. So I try not to romanticize it too much.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, it is quite funny in terms of, yeah, because England, because yeah, when you think of a chicken tikka, well, to be fair, it's not even like a curry isn't even, it's not even sort of traditionally Indian. It's sort of it was made by an Indian man in England, so it's a bit like okay, and but there is loads of foods here. There's loads of culture and influence. Like you walk through London, you know, you see so much diversity, and I'm sure it's probably the same for France. So
Yeah,
it's
I think we
interesting.
also there's something to be thinking about how cities like London, cities like Paris, like New York, like San Francisco, they actually have more in common with each other than they do with the other cities within the country themselves. It's like these world class cities all have a way of living and existing
Yeah,
that are more a reflection of a shared culture across world class cities than they are a reflection of the cities that they're in. Like for example, New York has more in common with Paris than it does with Birmingham, Alabama. Right? New York has more in common with Paris than it does with some random than Albany, New York.
yeah,
And so I think that there's a multiculturalism or a way of living across major areas that very often within European cities, they pick their most cosmopolitan place as the standard bearer for what the culture is. And, we don't get to do that in the States. Like, no one will ever say, oh, New York is the ultimate American city, although it is. People always pull New York outside of the States. Oh, but New York
yeah.
is different, right?
New York is
Oh, but Paris is different. It is quite different, but no one would ever say that, right? Like, you
yeah.
don't have to do that with European cultures. So,
So I'd love to sort of pivot and like you're doing quite interesting work in terms of working with philanthropists and doing philanthropic I'm glad I got that word right. Doing philanthropic
work.
activities with them. And so I guess could you just tell me a little bit about your job in which you do?
Yeah, totally. And so I work for the Bridge Bank Group, it's a nonprofit consulting group. So we work with nonprofits, foundations, philanthropic advisors. And our work is as consultants to create a more equitable and just world by supporting organizations that are driving that work, both in the United States and abroad. We have offices in New York. I work in our office in San Francisco. Our main office is in Boston, but we also have offices in Mumbai, and Singapore, and Johannesburg. And so within the organization, I lead our work in equitable philanthropy. And so I joke all the time that that means that work is to make sure, and leading equitable philanthropy, my job is to make sure it's not an oxymoron, right? That you
Yeah, I
can't,
was about to say it sounds kind of contradictory.
yeah, philanthropy in a work that's equitable in a way that, giving away money in ways that don't necessarily recreate the broken systems that allow people to amass a lot of money,
Mm,
right? And so I think, here's about systems change, about reinventing and reimagining the world and how it works, and really empowering those that have very often been marginalized by the systems of power as they exist now. You know, I find the work very freeing and gratifying. I know that a lot of people struggle with how do you work in philanthropy and because you're working with people that are in many ways the ultimate beneficiaries of a broken capitalist system.
mm,
But for me, I think of philanthropy as being a lot broader than the folks that are traditionally labeled philanthropists, right? So I don't think of philanthropy as simply pale, meal, and stale. I come from a community of folks that have always been extremely philanthropic and just genuine giving. Black and brown folks in America give away a larger percentage of their income to those that are less fortunate than actually billionaires in this country, right? So there's a giving culture, it's a philanthropic culture as well. And also for me, this is all about social change, funding social change, funding movements, funding leaders who are doing the work. And money's green, right? Like, how do you take it and use it in a way that makes sense
yeah.
and supports American money's green? That is. How do you use use it in a way that kind of supports community upliftment, and also from an American perspective, like how do you create new stories that are about equity,
Yeah.
changing systems? So that's my work in a nutshell. It's wonderful work. I get to work with leaders across the field. I have a wonderful podcast, Dreaming in Color, where I interview leaders across the social sector and get them to talk about Black and brown leaders and have them talk about what's the world that they imagine, what that would look like. And this is where being American is absolutely wonderful as well. America is a country of narratives, right? It's a country where basically people tell new narratives about themselves, about the country, and people live into those narratives, right? And so I get to help tell those new narratives. I get to help create new narratives. There's nothing. America's so wonderful in that literally, if you tell a story enough, it'll become true,
Yeah.
right? Here I am, like wealthy Black guy living in California who's a descendant of enslaved people, right? That's America, right? Like literally, my people. There was a meme that came across the other day. A friend sent it to me, cautioning Black Americans. There's this whole thing about the old money aesthetic. Right? Everyone wants the old.
Yeah.
And the person was like, let's not forget, we were the money. In the old world.
We made the old money.
Be careful of what aesthetic you're like. What we were considered currency, right? So you can only integrate to so many narratives naturally. But that's my work, and I get to work with a lot of cool folks doing great great activities across the country, across the world, to support really thoughtful leaders reimagining the world and creating more equitable systems.
Yeah, I really, that sounds really interesting, because I think being able to have some of the wealthiest people in the world like putting resources into nonprofits and making and creating social change, because as much as we would love the government to be able to just keep printing money and put it into social services, it isn't, I mean, you can't just keep printing money, we've got inflation now, but I think that it's really good to be able to pull in all the resources. We can also be using governments, but let's also use the people that have amassed this wealth to be making the world better.
Well, that's another space in which the American model is very different. I think that you guys in Europe actually have just more, you have more government, period. Finally, you have more government, right? So government has a more important role in social systems and supporting social structures. And we don't have that same approach here in the States. And so the nonprofit sector has always existed within the States to kind of pick up the slack where the government leaves work behind. Nonprofit sector is not a replacement for government, right? Like the government scalar when it comes to this marginalized groups, disenfranchised groups. But the nonprofit sector in the States is a very important role of kind of creating new programs, catalyzing new programs, incubating new programs that government can pick up and scale. And so that's a very important role for government. And philanthropy is the same. Like we have a American tax code system where people are allowed to hold on to large amounts of money in a way that you can't in Europe. Like the French system, like interestingly enough, I mean, the world's wealthiest person is now French. But historically speaking, the tax code, the way it works, like you're punished for amassing large amounts of money within a socialist system or more socialist democracies. And I use the term safely and broadly. And so I think that we didn't have that in the States. And so there was always this assumption that very, very wealthy people would be responsible for supporting the regions in which they live, right? Like the Rockefellers not only be Rockefellers, but they would also create parks and stadiums and opera houses and schools and universities, right? And so there's always been that expectation within the American model. I think we're trying to figure out within the country itself, like one, how much of that should still be in the hands of the usual gatekeepers and power holders from a financial perspective, and where that should be more equally distributed across the country and those that are in those spaces that make the most sense. And I think also it has a lot to do with the fact that our country is changing demographically as well, right? Like when you had a majority white country, it made more sense. I don't know if it ever made sense, but it made more sense for a small white minority to be making the decisions for that large population. But now as we have more Black and brown people and larger numbers within the country itself, you have to figure out what's the representation and leadership around that, and where in a way that wealth gap is not also a racial gap.
Yeah, I think because I think there definitely is some correlation between the wealth gap and a racial gap as well. Obviously we do have Black billionaires out there, and there are a lot of Black people that are doing well, but I think you usually find the people that are doing the menial jobs are sort of Black and brown people, immigrants that have just came to the country. And, I mean, we need everybody in society, but I think you can have governments can play such a big role in keeping some people down, but propping others up. And so, yeah, it's interesting. And I think, I don't know which systems I prefer. I like how the UK does. We have our NHS, and I like governments being involved, but I think with governments, it's hard because they always have an agenda in terms of like, I need to win an election. So I need to do things
Yeah.
that's going to win me in an election. I'm not thinking about how can I create a system which, even if I do leave, it can be picked up and we can continue, and it can like, because nothing is short term. Like everything we want to help and improve in the world is, it's going to take time, it's going to take resources, it's going to take grit and will, but the systems aren't built to allow
Yeah.
governments to do it.
Well, Tina, I think it's safe to say that none of the systems are working, right? So,
Yeah.
so it's unfortunate we have to choose between a whole bunch of broken systems. I think what's interesting about the American model is that it does, in theory, leave more space for community development, for kind of more of a community level change effort. And we need that within the States. America is a vast country. People live extremely differently. What works in New York may not work in California. It's not going to work in New Orleans or Chicago. And the vastness of America is always like jarring for me, someone who lives here, right? That I have to sit on a plane for 6 hours to go to a client meeting in my own country, right? Or the number of time zones I have to cross to arrange calls within my own country.
Yeah,
right?
you guys have so many different time zones. Never
Because
understood it.
we're a huge country, and I think that people don't recognize as well. Like, we're a huge country, and culturally we're very different, right? We have very different starting points across the country. To grow up in a region like New Orleans, which is a southern region, but a southern region with French and Spanish ancestry, the cultural values and norms are very different. They're very different from New York, which is, originally colonized by the Dutch. Very different from Boston, colonized by British Puritans, or New Haven, colonized by the Quakers. Like, so these cities have very, very different ways of living and thinking, and so there's a common thread that we try to make. We try to tell a story that's inclusive enough of all America, and we thank Hollywood for that. But that doesn't always work, right? And so how do we have areas that are more regionally run, regionally focused? But what's the system that kind of joins it all together? The European system is really interesting, and I can speak more from the French system than the British system, because I still don't understand how you guys still live in monarchy.
Yeah, I would like to hear about the French system.
Yeah, but within the French system, there was a monarchy. There was a closed group of people that you could only be a part of unless you married into or were born into, right? And so this idea of a closed culture, it made complete sense. So when the French overthrew the aristocratic system, they developed a democratic approach where, we were all equal, and it took a lot of work. They overthrew the monarch. They also overthrew the church, because you had to, right? They were hand in hand. Like, the oldest child became an aristocrat, and the second youngest child became a priest, right? They were working together. Interesting enough, in the United States, we didn't have that same monarchical system within the states itself. So we still, to some degree, had an aristocracy, financial aristocracy, but there was always this belief that it was open, right? That everyone could be a part of it, although that's not necessarily true. And so, whereas in France, the idea of fighting to remove a group became very central to, the culture of itself. In the United States, interestingly enough, Americans fight, some Americans, well, not all of them, many Americans fight to preserve our system and hope that one day they will be a member of that group, right? And so you'll have, like, literally poor white people fighting to preserve Republican values, whatever the hell that means, and like these oppressive capitalist systems, because there's a hope that one day
I have my American dream,
right? And so you'll have the Joe the Plumber conversation. Barack Obama, many years ago, he was on the campaign trail. He was confronted by Joe the Plumber, a guy who said, Obama, I hear you want to raise our taxes. And Obama was like, no, I want to raise taxes on people making over $150,000 a year. And he asked Joe the Plumber, how much money do you make? And Joe the Plumber, first of all, lied and said he made $70,000. The truth was he made only $30,000 or $40,000. And he's like, well, this won't impact you. This is people making double what you make. And Joe the Plumber looked at him with a straight face and said, well, what if I buy my company and start making that money? And America being America, Barack Obama couldn't say, Joe, you will never buy your company.
Yeah.
You will never make $50,000. In fact, statistically speaking, your kids will probably never make it. You can't say that, right? You have to let Joe hold on to his musings, right? And as a result, Joe ended up voting for whoever the Republican was voting at the time, because he was afraid of taxes. And it's like, and so that's where, like, America has this very weird kind of appreciation of a closed system of wealth, in hopes that folks will be members of that group and get to have that power, that it's not true.
Yeah,
So,
it's just like how, and you know what? As much as I'm not a fan of Trump, I do have to give him some props for how he's able to generate his base and his following and support, because he made everybody that voted for him feel like they could be him, or like they could be a part of his group, or I can be rich one day, and I can try and take down the
yeah,
establishment, even
yeah.
though he is so a part of the establishment. Like he convinced
No, no,
everybody that
totally.
he was not a part of the
I give Trump,
establishment.
I give Trump absolutely no praise. He's an absolute nightmare. I think that he took advantage of existing American myths and narratives. This is wonderful. So he's an expert manipulator, right?
Mm,
And I don't give people props for that. I think there's
fair
this
enough.
wonderful French concept called the jeu de miroir, the mirror move, and it's the belief that you attribute to your enemy the things that you hate the most about. Once again, you attribute to your enemy the things that you hate the most about yourself, right? And I think that Trump is a master maneuver of that. In French culture, you see it all the time, right? The French are always quick to talk about American materialism, American violence, and American sexuality. It's like France. I remember being in grad school and having a professor talking about American materialism. Like I just walked past Cartier, Yves Saint Laurent, and Hermes to get to this class. And you're going to lecture me about American materialism? Something down, right? Like I'm fine with that. I think within white American culture, you see it what white Americans, Trump supporters attribute to immigrants, attribute to Black people. It's the things that they hate the most about themselves, right? It's
Mm.
like Trump came out the gate calling Mexican immigrants predators, right? Lazy predators, right? He was talking about himself, right? It was easier to attribute that to another group than to
Yeah.
your own self. And so I think that you see a lot of that mirror move, a lot of that projecting in American culture. It's a lot easier to say that this is a problem because of immigrants coming over. This is a problem because the way that white Americans in the South have this narrative about Black Americans being lazy. These are literally the people that they stole from Africa to work their plantation.
Far from lazy. Far from it.
I mean, wait, what? Right? Like, not hardworking. Okay, what? Right?
Well,
So I think that you have to be careful about how very often those narratives become a projection. Like all of America's social issues could be solved with a really good community and army of social workers and
yeah,
therapists. Focus
probably.
on mental health issues for sure.
Yeah, you know what, I've heard even people say that about like in relationships, that like if you're usually mad at your partner, like, or like they're not doing something that you'd like, is sometimes usually something you're more thinking about. Oh no, I don't do this, but because they don't do it, I'm mad at them. But really, like, just look back at your own behavior and figure out what you're annoyed about, because that's usually what's
100%.
annoying you.
100%. I think it's that within relationships. I think I'll see it within parents and children, right? I
Mm.
think that parents are most annoyed by those things they see in their kids that they hate in themselves, right? It's like, oh my God, he got that from me. I hate that trait in myself. He's so headstrong, so bossy. It's like, oh, where did he get that? Oh, he got that from me. Oh God,
Yeah,
I hate
yeah. He's
that.
been
So,
watching me the whole time.
got it honest, completely honest. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask in terms of working in philanthropy. I said that so wrong. Is there any
Working philanthropy.
um is there any sort of contradictions in philanthropy and racial equity? And I think some people might be thinking, why are millionaires sort of wanting to give to causes and stuff like that? Like, what are them real motivations? Some people might be thinking, oh, it's just sort of for clout. But you're
Yeah.
working with these people, so I'm sure you get a bit more of the real side of them than anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think there definitely are people who give as a way of just flexing and
Mm,
demonstrating wealth, who don't give in a way that's genuine and sincere. And those exist in all places, right? In all spaces. I mean, I would like to think that the people that we work with are definitely very committed to social change and creating a stronger and more thoughtful society, more thoughtful country itself. I think there's been a real shift in many ways in how people think about philanthropy in general over the past 10 years or so. And I think that when I started this work maybe 10 years ago, you amass $1 billion and giving away a portion of it becomes a way of almost like optically showing your wealth and your prestige, right? Like, oh, yes,
mm,
my foundation over here, right? It becomes almost like a moniker of your wealth. And I think interestingly enough, and also in that perspective as well, your having amassed $1 billion was seen as proof of how well you can give away $1 billion with transferable skills, right? Like, I've amassed $1 billion, I'm going to teach others how they can be wealthy and successful, right? I think where the shift now is that ultimately, I think that many people giving away lots of money recognize that they're in amassing $1 billion, they've harmed the world. Like, it's hard to amass that much without doing harm to the world, right?
Just a little bit.
And how do you right. And so how do you use the money that you've amassed to repair the harm that you created in amassing it, right? And that's kind of this idea of more of a reparative approach to philanthropy. Is very different. And when you come into that, not necessarily seeing yourself as the person with the answers, but only the person with the money, right? Or not necessarily seeing, and this is very, it's very counter in many ways, some of the founding principles of our country that we don't talk about, the Puritan work ethic, that basically wealth was a product of your worth. Like, wealthy people were going to heaven. Like, wealth was in the Protestant world, right? What people being wealthy was a sign that they were going to heaven.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
It's a very, and so wealth was right? It was a sign that you were chosen by God, right? Which is so unchristian, right? Like, I grew up in a liberation.
Just a little bit. God only loves rich people.
My minister was talking about, the Bible says very clearly that, that it's harder for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than it is for it's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get to heaven. I grew up learning that, and so I got them. So billionaires like, you realize you're not going to heaven.
Just because you're rich, you ain't going.
Just because you're rich, right? So I think that there's been, in many ways, a shift in how we think about not only the value of wealthy people in the sense of, like, your wealth is the product of hard work and all those things, like, in many ways, pulling apart the myth of American exceptionalism and hard work and Protestant work ethic and all those things, but also understanding how your wealth is actually the product of a broken system, and a misuse of power to some degree, intentionally or not, and how to use your funds to create a more equitable and just society, recognizing that your wealth is of no worth if the country's no longer existing.
Yeah,
right?
If no one can buy your products or buy your services because everyone is, too broke, too poor, too something.
Exactly. And so I think that people are really trying to rethink how to structure the system in a way that, allows for clearly capitalistic endeavors. I mean, no one's trying to completely overhaul capitalism. Good luck with that. But because socialism and communism don't work for people of color either, just for the record. But also, how do you do so in a way that allows more people to be brought into the big tent of successful and actually allows success to be defined differently?
Yeah. And I think just like when we're getting everybody thriving, like the whole, like everything gets propped up, doesn't it? Like if everybody's able to go and feed their families and, go and then, you can feed your families, you can maybe then be like, okay, what do I want to do in my life? How can I get more money? And then, like, everyone is sort of going to be benefiting from the flow of the system and everyone, being happy and healthy.
I think 100%. I think it's a question of both everyone benefiting from the system to some degree, but also what a more wonderful and beautiful system is when everyone can contribute to it. Right? Can you imagine how absolutely boring and uninteresting America would be if Black and brown people weren't here? Right? I mean, no shade Australia, but the world doesn't need another one of those, right? So I think that I think there's something to be said about how do we acknowledge the fact that there's a lot of Black and brown genius that shapes this country and makes it a wonderful place. How do we elevate that genius and allow that genius to shine, right? I think it's not just a question of people benefiting from it, but we all benefit from in America where there are more Black and brown people in leadership roles, in entertainment roles, in wealth roles, as cultural, gatekeepers, as cultural influencers. It's just a more interesting, beautiful place to be, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, and so how do we allow that to be demonstrated and showcased as well?
Yeah, definitely. And as you were saying, we've got a demographic that is changing as well. So, like, they need to be representing 100%. Those people.
Yeah, people of color are dope as hell.
There's
right? Like, what is,
no lies about it.
There's no right. Like, so
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, and we've got leaders like, I say we, I mean, you guys, I mean, no, I'm not going to say about the UK. I mean, we've got Richie Sunak, but that's a class and a wealth thing.
I
That's
mean,
like,
this is oh goodness, yeah. There's a
yeah, exactly.
lot
But
going on.
you guys have got someone like AOC who was working as a bar woman, as a a bar staff, and now she's
Yeah,
one of the most famous politicians in the world, and she sort of
yeah,
stays authentic to who she is and is
yeah.
standing up for the little.
100%. I also worked on that. AOC was working as a barman or a bar person. I don't know what term is now, but she was also extremely well educated. She didn't
Yeah,
roll out from middle school and start working as a bartender, right? And then go into Congress, right? She's well educated, done all the schooling and all the things. And I think you see that across the country. It's one of the wonderful things I love about my podcast is that I get to talk with these people who are just out the gate, like just absolutely wonderfully brilliant people. And it gives me so much hope for the world because like the world's an absolute mess right now, but we have ridiculously brilliant and talented people who are working to fix it. And giving those folks a space to shine, giving those folks, there's this wonderful quote by Angel Kyoto Williams, an American thinker, if you will, Black American thinker. And she talks about how love is space, right? How do we show love by giving people space to shine, space to be? And I think that when you are able to showcase Black and Brown excellence, as we say in the States, you actually shine a light on white mediocrity. Like AOC is absolutely brilliant, and it shines, but also shows how unbrilliant her white colleagues are. Right? I think that's worth calling out as well, right? People who are in positions of power who are not that smart at all; they're just privileged. And so, how do you actually allow folks who have the talent, have the skills to rise into positions of power and to act as leaders and leverage that power in a way that shapes the world differently for those that are coming behind from them?
At the end of the day, we want the best people and like the most passionate people in those jobs. You know what I mean? Black, brown, white, whatever you are, we just want we don't want you to be there because of privilege, because then as well you're not doing the job. Like you're not doing stuff that's going to actually help everyone.
Yeah, totally. I think that you want different people in a position. I think it's also we need a team of people with different ways of thinking. The world is a mess right now, and smart white men have had their chance for the past 300 years to shape it in a way that makes sense, and it's not working. We're not going to smart white boy our way out of the world right now. Black people, some smart women, we need some other smart people to be thinking through, because clearly the way that exists now ain't working.
Yeah.
Right. I think we need a broader team of folks with some different ways of thinking and different ways of acting as well.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, those are the best ways. I just wanted to ask you two more questions. In terms of being a leader, especially being a Black leader that is also gay as well, like how do you handle being that? How do you handle being a leader?
Yeah, funny enough, I've never really, once again, go back to my grandmother's quote of like God giving us all free will and making us all very different. My grandmother always said, if God wanted us to be the same, he would have made us all the same, but he made us all very different for a reason. And so for me, what I am is what I am. Like I don't know any differently, right? So it's very normal for me. I think that with all of my attributes, be it Black, be it gay, be it French speaking, be it from New Orleans, all those things, they give me a source of wisdom to pull from and a community to lean on. So they've all been complete assets and attributes to me. I share this story all the time. I'll share it with you quickly. So I joke that I've had several coming outs to my family. When I came home from college freshman year, I went to Howard. It was like, very like hippy dippy, super smart Black kids who they would all be on pork and meat and all these things. So I came from New Orleans. I went to Howard. I came back freshman year and I given up meat. Because it's short-lived, don't worry. I told my mom that I'd given up meat at home for Christmas, and she cried. Like
you were like, okay.
I kept passing out because I was eating I grew up in like meat, starch, vegetable home. I didn't realize you couldn't just eat starch, vegetable and be vegetarian; you would die.
Yeah.
So, just eat meat until the summer. When you come back, we'll figure out your diet routine, and you can go vegetarian. But just eat meat for now, right? And I started eating meat and it never stopped. I went off to school in Paris my junior year abroad. I came out to myself, but more importantly, I had a crisis of faith. Right? I wasn't sure that God existed anymore, or that the God that exists was one I was interested in. And I came home to New Orleans and I told my mom this time, I was like, I don't think I believe in God anymore. My mother said, without skipping a beat, that's okay. God still believes in you. right? Crisis of faith, or all smart people have crisis of faith, right?
Mm.
And then I came home for my first year of grad school in Paris, and I was living with my boyfriend at the time. I wasn't out to my family. And he kept calling us before cell phones. I'm old. He kept calling the house. And my mother was like, "Oh, this Stefan keeps calling. Like, is he your roommate or is he your boyfriend? Like, are you gay?" Right? And I was like, "I'm gay. It's my boyfriend." To which my mother responded, "You're not the only one," completely unfazed. And so many years
Fair enough.
all the things I've ever shared with you, my giving up meat was the only thing that ever got a visceral response. I mean, without an ounce of irony. Well, your father and I have only ever wanted for you to be happy. And I just saw you, I just could understand why you would give up eating meat. Like, that just seemed like a lifestyle choice. I just saw no path to happiness with that lifestyle choice. And that made me sad for you. The other things, I mean, giving up God, I'm good going gay. I know lots of happy people who are gay or who are godless, right? But the giving up meat, like, why would you do that to yourself, right? And so that's like my family. Like, it's a very different, like a very progressive, thoughtful family. And I always had kind of working models of what it means to be gay and be Black and successful, right? And so that's where I didn't necessarily have the same societal stereotypes around the issues, and I had my own, which were really powerful and important ones. So that was, so that for me is I've always thought of my gayness as I've always thought of my gayness as a huge asset more than anything, not ability. Yeah.
Nice. That is a funny story. The only time she cried, she didn't see happiness in me. I love that. That just sort of speaks like just sort of a black family. Like, you're just like, no, me. Are you okay?
Why would you choose that lifestyle for yourself? Like, what in the world? So yeah.
But I mean, it's also glad that your mom and your family were supportive of you, and that you saw. And I think what you said, which should be highlighted, is that you saw Black, gay, successful leaders, and it wasn't phased, because you're like, they're doing it, and I've got all the tools to do it, and I've seen them do it, so I can do it. I can do it better, or I can do it differently to them and just do it myself.
I also have, I'll talk about it as well as often, but my great-grandfather, so my grandmother's father, was gay as well. So he divorced his wife in the 30s and lived with his partner in New Orleans in the French Quarter, as gay couples did at the time. And so there was already a working model of a successful gay professional person in my family. And so, that was, I think that, when you've seen others doing it, it's been normalized. You normalize it as well, and you don't think of it as an issue, right? So yeah.
Yeah, nice. So Darren, I've loved this whole conversation that we've had, and I just wanted to ask you one final question, which I always ask all my guests is, say if there's a young Black boy listening to this podcast, how can something that help them with an understanding of themselves?
Interesting. It's a great question. And I think that one of the biggest, I go back to my grandmother's quote about living your life as beautifully as possible for a reason. I think that instilled in me at a very early age that I was not a mistake. Everything that I was on purpose and beautiful in its own rightful way. And my job was to make beauty out of it. And so I think that Black Americans, particularly in the South, those of us who grew up in Black liberation theology, we truly believe that there's a little bit of divinity in all of us. Right? There's a little bit of God in all of this, right? And so for that young Black boy listening, I encourage them to find that God within them and showcase that God here that's beautiful and meaningful, and that brings them some degree of joy. And I encourage them to live their life in a way that someone coming after them can see them as a model. Even at whatever young age, right? There's always someone looking at you. No matter how young you are, there's always folks looking up to you and seeing how you're behaving, seeing how you're interacting, seeing how you're taking up space in the world. And so I encourage folks to find the divinity within, let the divinity shine. There's a little bit of God in all of us, and some of us is a whole lot of God. Some of us is a little bit, some of us is a little bit, a whole lot of God, right? How you let the divinity shine, and how do you live your life in a way that brings you some degree of happiness, knowing that God wants you to be happy. He created this world for you to be happy, right? So how do you let that happiness shine, and in doing so, create space for others to live and seeing you as a normal path as well?
No, brilliant, Darren. Yeah, definitely. I love that. So thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Been fun.
It has been definitely. Hopefully we can do it again.
It's fall when I'm in Paris, gotta come visit.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, I always want to go to San Francisco at some point. My brother supports Golden State, so I'm sure if I was like, bro.
California. I'm always rooting for California. California is a wonderful place. We're always rooting for Antarctic space. So yes, it's lovely out here. All right. Talk later.
Bye-bye.
So that is the end of the episode. Thank you very much for getting to the end of this episode, guys. I really hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed talking to Darren. I think all the stuff that we were talking about is super important, and even just shedding the light on some of the billionaires that are out there that are giving out towards equitable and, equitable causes, but also wanting to help create social change. And I really think that it's really good to have these sort of conversations, because there's a lot of discord about billionaires and their place in society and all of this and that. And so I think it's really good to have these sort of conversations. And Darren went to Howard, and he's also been to Paris to study, so having him come on and talk about those experiences I think are really interesting, especially for people here in the UK where we don't have black universities. We have our different plights, but I really think that's quite cool having a black university, and I'd love to attend Howard. If anybody wants to do a week in Howard with me, I'd love to do such things. But either way, I just want to say thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for engaging. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Please subscribe, and also put a comment into the comment section what you thought about this episode. In the show notes, I'm going to put Darren's social media tags and everything, so you can go and find out a bit more about him and the brilliant work that he's doing. If you're in San Francisco, if he's doing anything, go meet him. I don't know, just go meet him, but if I'm going to San Francisco, I'm definitely going to go meet him. And he offered me Paris, so I might go and check out Paris. Why not? But I really hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I really enjoyed talking to Darren. There's going to be a new episode out of the podcast next week, so look out for that. And yeah, I don't think I have much more else to say other than thank you very much for listening, and we will talk soon.